you take me somewhere else? Somewhere where I don't belong, and we hide there till morning.
I can't remember anything without you.
That's very sweet, but try, okay? I've loved you for a very long time.
Hi guys, it's Lauren. So, as you just saw in those clips, the very first part of my spring break trip was to St. Andrews in Scotland, and that was the very first time I've ever traveled to Scotland, and I completely fell in love with everything about it. And dare I say, I think I like Scotland more than I like England, but that's like a whole nother topic to talk about. So, initially, I had no plans to travel for spring break. I didn't want to really travel at all because I had a lot of travel anxiety still, and it's very uncomfortable for me to travel so abruptly and so frequently in such a small time period. But I decided that I should go because I didn't want to waste my study abroad time just sitting around in Liverpool. So I thought it was okay to at least travel around Great Britain because it's not that far away, but it's still far enough to explore something new and something that I've never seen before. I could not have done this trip without my very, very dear friend Salma, who's like one of the best people in the world, so like big shout out to her, and I thank her so much for taking me along on this journey with her. Even though it was a very super stressful time for us, like we were literally planning our accommodations and our trains like the night before, or even hours before we took our trip. It was so worth it, and we promised ourselves that no matter how we got there or where we went, that we would have a great time together, and we would always be discovering something new. So it was never a dull time when I was like traveling with her, so it was pretty awesome. Alright, so starting off our journey from Liverpool to St. Andrews, we actually like immediately hit a bump in the road because of the stupid and frustrating train system that they have in the UK. But I won't get into that because once we landed in St. Andrews, it was like a paradise for us. Salma actually had a friend who was studying in St. Andrews, and we were able to stay with her in her dormitory for a few nights, so thank you to Mira for having us. On the very first day, we didn't really do much because a lot of our time was spent traveling to St. Andrews, so we just kind of explored around town, and it was a very beautiful day, so sunny. So we walked along the beachside. There was the St. Andrews Cathedral and the St. Andrews Castle that we went to. There were a few surrounding museums, and just the town itself is very small, but it was very full of history and such a cute place to be honest. At nighttime, we took a ghost walking tour. It was my first ghost walking tour, and we were also the only two people who attended. So we basically got a private tour by this guy, and he took us around different spots of St. Andrews where there were paranormal activity happening. It kind of did get scary at some points because it was so dark at that time and there were so little people around that I was kind of just waiting for a ghost to appear out of nowhere. On our second day, we actually didn't have any plans either, so what we did was we went to the information center in town and we asked them what we should do. And they suggested that we just visit the surrounding towns, since St. Andrews is one of the many fishing towns that are in Scotland. So we took a bus and we went to our first stop, which was Crail. And it was so beautiful because we just kind of sat on a bench for quite a long time, listening to the ocean, staring at the sea and the sunlight. It was so relaxing. And then we went down to the harbor and we got to see the clear, clear water that they had with all the rocks. And it felt so peaceful just to be there. Then we hopped back on the bus and we went to the next town called Instruther, which apparently had a fisher's museum, but we got there a bit too late to actually go inside. So instead we went to the very famous and popular fish and chip restaurant that was in this town. I think the fish and chip was alright. It was a very fast-paced business with like huge lines for this fish and chip, but at the very end we did get ice cream, so I think it was worth it. We wanted to continue exploring and see how far we got with these fishing towns, so we ended up walking all the way to our next town, which is called Pittenweem. To get to this next town, we ended up having to walk this long stretch of road where literally from left to right you saw nothing but fields, and the only lights that we saw were from the cars that were passing by. And it was like something out of an Ed Sheeran music video, like Castle on the Hill. It took us like 30 minutes just to walk down this road, and once we got there, everything was basically closed, but we still wanted to explore the town. I think it was still worth it just for the adventure because we had a lot of fun just exploring this empty town. The next few days, we ended up taking day trips to different parts of Scotland. So our first trip was to the Blair Atholl Castle.
I finally feel like this is the right life, and I'm on it now. I was a bit off track for a while, here and there. Not exactly know who I was. Now I think I know.
I wasn't able to take any photographs or recordings while inside the castle, but I can tell you that inside it was so massive and full of paintings and portraits of the family's history. And there were 12 dukes who ruled over this castle, and there is still a duke today who has the ownership of the land. Inside they had authentic Scottish weaponry, gear, clothing. They had antlers lining the halls of the Scottish deer that they had on the land. Also, each room was completely furnished and totally different than the other, that showed how the royalty lived in that castle while they were still staying there. They also had a man playing bagpipes outside the castle every hour, and that just totally made up the whole experience of being in Scotland. It was also a very special and unique day to visit the castle because that night they had a ceremony and people from all over the world were coming to visit the Blair Atholl Castle, and I think it was something like a whiskey club basically. People signed up all over the world to come and visit this castle. This meant that the castle had to close early, but we were allowed to stay on the garden grounds while we were still visiting. So there was a huge farm of sheep that was across from the castle that we had so much fun with. And then right next to that was the Hercules Garden, which had many statues, a lake, and a Chinese bridge that I completely admired so much. There was also a forest of massive trees that were the tallest trees in the country, and some of the trees that were planted there were actually planted by Queen Victoria herself. We ended up staying on the grounds a little longer than we were supposed to, but we found this swing set in the children's playground that they had, and swinging on those swing sets was one of the funnest memories I have from our trip, because we were just acting like children, singing songs while the ceremony was happening and bagpipes were playing in the background. Yeah, we didn't really know if we were still supposed to be there, but no one was kicking us out, so we stuck around and we watched people enter the castle as bagpipes were playing with this line of men in kilts. And it made me feel so in Scotland, and I was so in love with everything that was happening. But we did eventually have to leave because it was getting pretty late and we had to head back to St. Andrews. The very next morning we headed straight to Glasgow. First thing we did was we went to a cafe called the Olive Tree, and it was actually inside of a church, which was very interesting, but also a very unique experience. And I had my very first scone while I was there. Very British. This was such a big contrast from being in the quiet and calm Blair Atholl to like the center of the city, Glasgow, and everything was just very busy and noisy. There was just so much to see, so we took a bus tour around town where we got to see a little bit of everything of Glasgow while we were there. One of the things that we did want to see was the Kelvin Grove Museum, which was actually so massive. I feel like we only saw a quarter of what we wanted to see before it ended up closing. There were taxidermy of all different kinds of animals. There was an Egyptian section, which I'm sure Salma loved. And there was a section about extinct animals and the history of animals that were in Scotland, which I found very interesting. There was a whole nother section full of art pieces that were in the Kelvin Grove Museum, but we weren't able to have time to visit it. Once the museum closed, we had a little bit of time to visit the University of Glasgow, which was right next to the museum, and we just saw all the academic buildings and the architecture that it had on campus. At that point, we were really on a time crunch and we nearly missed our tour bus that was going back into the city. We spent the rest of our time in Glasgow trying to retrace some of the places that were mentioned on our bus tour. For example, there was the tallest cinema in the world, and I think this place had 12 stories. We also just walked around the square, which had many notable statues. I think we also tried to go to a student art museum. We also visited Glasgow Cathedral. We stopped by the Royal Concert Hall and the Royal Conservatoire, which had, I think, David Tennant from Doctor Who attended this. I wish I could have spent more time in Glasgow because I feel like our time was very cut short since we had to travel all the way back to St. Andrews at the very end. So maybe I'll come back some other day. At the very end of our stay, before leaving St. Andrews to go to Edinburgh, we had to stop by the North Point Cafe, which was the meeting place of Kate and Prince William of England. Prince William and Kate actually met while they were attending the University of St. Andrews, and I just think it's really cute that this place shows that this is where they met to grab a coffee at some point. So yeah, that was the first part of my spring break trip, and there is so much more to cover in my upcoming videos. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye.